You know, it only just now occurred to me on the cusp of 100 subscribers that most of my reviews of the last 3 months have been kinda negative. I'd say only the Danganronpa and Fallout 4 reviews aren't weighed down with negativity, even if I did like a few of the other games overall, and even if it's just how things happen to turn out, that's not how I want to be known. I mean, sure, I adore my critical faculties and I love exercising them, but I do want to show off that I have the capacity to enjoy games once in a while as well. So, Turok. Now, I vaguely remember that there were plans to remaster this, but when it actually landed it was a bit of a shock, but I bought it on the damn day. Turok was my shit! Well, for the few moments I played my uncle's Nintendo 64 however many years ago. But man, what a trip. I think everyone's buying this just for nostalgia. We all remember the multitude of weapons, the great enemy animations, the huge sprawling levels with all the fog. Turok was one of the original console exclusive 3D first person shooters, and combined with GoldenEye made a case for the Nintendo 64 as a legit hardcore platform back in the day. But is it actually any good? The story of Turok is you go places and shoot things. There is an actual setup involving someone called the Campaigner, who Turok has to stop, but there is literally nothing in the actual game to suggest there's a reason for all the cross-temporal shenanigans. But I also remember there being a fairly popular comic book series out at the time. I imagine there'd have to be some greater background there. I mean, there's no way a developer just wouldn't explain the time travel elements at all, right? That'd be crazy. I'll stop. You know what else I remember? Acclaim. When I got to this logo at the start, I laughed. Maybe the rather bitter downturn of THQ has dulled everyone's memories, but for us there at the time, there was no publisher who crashed and burned quite like Acclaim in 2004. For everyone who tugged at their collars at the way EA marketed Dante's Inferno, Acclaim was probably the original master, quote unquote, at terribly outlandish marketing ploys. Encouraging people to get speeding tickets in support of Burnout 2? That was a thing. Telling people to name their kids Turok? That was true, but I think we all remember BMX XXX. Exploitation has not borne a better name since, if you ask me, but then you get to the iguana logo and get a bit sad. Ah well. So I played a bit of this 5 years ago when I was tinkering around with emulators, and I remember being quite surprised at how well it held up, and I was kinda sad I never saw it through. Having obviously now seen the credits, I can say I do still see a glimmer of inspiration, but also the obvious constraints of 20-year-old hardware holding it back. But even so, this isn't simply a case of the little game that could, or the game being too ambitious for the devs to know what they were doing. It's hard to really pin down, but I feel like there was a sort of brazen stupidity to the design of Turok. I imagine it went down like this. Iguana Entertainment receives a dev kit for the N64 and realizes they can make huge, good-looking, lush, open levels. And considering how quickly Turok launched next to the console, I imagine they wanted to do this to try and sell the power of the console itself. But at around the halfway mark, someone told the level designers they should probably try to justify the levels being as big as they are. And suddenly there's this whole angle with finding keys to unlock levels from a branching hub. But then what else do you do with the empty space? Obviously you include a live system and fill the spaces with a bunch of Doritos that give you an extra life upon getting 100, Mario style. Yeah, that's not really fair. Going around and actually finding loot is pretty sweet in all respects. The levels are all huge even by today's standards, so as settings the levels are all sold really well. Going through jungles, caves, catacombs, lost cities and so on makes for a rather grand feel, despite the actions you perform in the levels. Exploration is just a good carnal aside to all the shooting, and it makes you approach levels rather methodically. Thank heavens there's a map you can pull up at any time. It still all feels like it's a very different beast from the shooters of today, never mind from back in the day. It practically feels almost Metroidvania in scale, and considering how closely this launched near Symphony of the Night, you could be forgiven for suggesting this was also one of the progenitors of the genre. But you'd have to lack some serious critical faculties to do it in the first place. Exploring and finding secret areas or hidden pockets of goodies tends to lead to only 3 things. A key, all of which you need to find to complete the game, a piece of the Chrono Scepter, a 4-shot weapon you can only use on the final boss, and health, ammo, and Doritos. There are no real environmental upgrades, so to speak, nothing like a double jump. Even finding new weapons is rare, which is sad considering just how many guns are in the game. I wouldn't say it gets tiresome, but it can become overwhelming. Having maps this open becomes a bit of a burden when the level designers just had to splinter off so many keys to so many locations. Later levels are not just filled with little nooks and crannies, but often separate elaborate big areas, where mapping out relative positions in your head becomes very taxing. And considering you really do need every key to beat the game, it leads to a lot of back and forth in the best cases and becoming completely lost in others. The Catacombs level was just quite bad because everything is locked and the only way to navigate the level is to go around in circles unlocking everything, and it's nearly impossible to tell where you have or have not been. Still, the fact that levels are so big makes them stand out if nothing else, and having to actively explore gives a much greater sense of personal investment in the game, despite frequent moments of pure frustration. They're also a nice counterpoint to the combat, which isn't really great by any standard. The presentational value of the enemies is still awesome. Their animations might not have ragdoll physics or anything, but they were certainly very dynamic for their day. Shoot an opponent running at you and they'll trip in the midst of their sprint, which can actually hurt you if a bigger enemy falls on you. But the AI is not that complex. It's either a rushdown tactics or sniper tactics, and nothing in between. Any sort of cunning on the part of the enemy forces is simply due to the fact that they respawn, and with frightening speed at that. Again, while this does justify the large maps, they're a frustrating part of the game on their own. The lack of a locational damage indicator is probably the worst part of Turok, and I kinda wish they could have plugged it in for the remaster. It's both because enemies respawn and because they tend to camp and shoot from far away that it's often difficult to tell where you are getting hit from, especially on some of the earlier levels. And although dying is actually very hard to do, it can be difficult to keep your health above the 50% mark. Your health just yo-yos as Doom-style packets of health bookend big encounters with lots of different enemies on all sides. Although circle strafing is as purely cathartic now as it was back then, and probably easier to pull off with a 360 controller than with the Naboo Starfighter-shaped N64 controller, it's easy to see just how far we've come in terms of mechanical complexity. The only thing left to really talk about in terms of gameplay is the platforming, which, oof. In some cases they bring a nice sense of variety and emphasise the verticality and scale of the environments, but in most cases they're pretty bad. This is what hell looks like. A bunch of suspended pillars meant to judge your jumping skills with a bunch of cheap tricks for no reason. No, I can't even pretend. The platforming sucked then, and it sucks now. And that's about it. Turok is not a particularly difficult game to grasp on a mechanical level, and the game's age shows handily. There isn't a hell of a lot to make me say this was an underappreciated gem, but on another level I think the game really works. See, in all manner of mechanical substance the game is shallow. Shooting is simple, enemies are dumb, you could even argue the exploration is not that intense, but I'd still call it one of the more involving shooters in recent memory. The way the devs really went for the open level design shows in every facet of the game, and it's the intersectionality between all of the parts that makes Turok really kinda mesmerizing to play. The shooting being fast and fairly lethal means you need those secret pickups to keep your health and ammo always ticking up, and in tandem that shooting also justifies the huge spaces to explore. Have I mentioned how big the levels are? I might have neglected to mention. There honestly is kind of a real simple joy to just running around these big environments that still look pretty good to this day, even with all the draw distance cutting fog lying around. And the fact that the developers had enough ingenuity to realise they needed a bit more meat on the game's bones to make these environments worth exploring is what keeps Turok going. See, I'm not usually a sum of all parts kind of critic. I think the best pieces of media are the ones that are the most artistically cohesive, where every facet of the game was thought about in relation to their influence on each other, and breaking down a game into graphics, gameplay, longevity misses the point by a long shot. But for Turok, I'd have to concede it's not a game where everything is created equally, but enough of it is working in tandem with each other to elevate it. That is, until the final levels of the game. I haven't mentioned it, but one observation I carried throughout was on the title. Turok Dinosaur Hunter? There are very few dinosaurs up to this point, and they're arguably the weakest enemies in the game. That is until you hit the Lost Land, where suddenly velociraptors have lasers strapped to their backs, which is unbelievably the tip of the iceberg. Here's a short list of some of the enemies you fight in the last hour of the game. Weird alien lizard men, weird alien lizard men with jetpacks, and Kylosaurs with laser cannons, men riding Triceratops with rocket launchers strapped to them, robots, Audrey 2.
Crab people, crab people, crab people.
On top of that, the last 2 levels are uncharacteristically linear. I have this theory, and I'm too lazy to look this up, not that I'm sure I'd find anything, but I think the last 2 levels may have been the first levels to actually be designed, after all the enemies and weapons were programmed. There's very little in the way of active variety in the same vein that permeates the rest of the game. For the Lost Land, this still kinda works, if only in terms of difficulty, but for the final confrontation, it's a real slog of a level. It's just corridor after corridor after corridor of shooting, and the enemies here tend to feel especially cheap. Think of the worst Quake level you've played and you might have a good idea. Then you have a fight with a cyborg T-Rex, and he's actually pretty easy to get stuck on scenery and cheese out. Early FPS AI mixed with early FPS geometry. And then comes the actual final boss. He sucks, and then after a short cinema, credits. Wait, I could have sworn there was at least a little epilogue after the fight in the original version. Before we conclude this, a quick word on the remaster. The resolution options all seem dandy, and the base frame rate is obviously better, but it tends to crumble when there's fire effects on screen? Sure. Now, the music was brought over perfectly, which is great because it's actually a pretty tight part of the game despite sounding like it was composed with 0 effort. Take this opening level theme for example. I would be surprised if that took more than 10 minutes to compose, but it still sounds great, doesn't it? But the bitrate of some of the sound effects could have used a bit more work. Well anyway, Turok is still pretty good, but let's face it, you're only going to buy it for nostalgia. It has been superseded, and quite easily. If you want carnal circle strafing action, get Serious Sam. If you want great environmental exploration, get Metroid Prime. Turok might be a happy medium, but definitely not a gleeful one. At the very least, I think we can say this game has now officially aged better than GoldenEye. There are apparently plans for a remaster of the sequel, Seeds of Evil, and I don't know if I'll be picking that up. I have literally never played it, so I don't have a frame of reference. Maybe for the sake of completion, we'll see. If anything, I'd love to see a remaster of the 3rd game, Shadow of Oblivion, if only to reintroduce this generation to the best James Bond one-liner in all of gaming.
You're too loud.
Awesome. Big Boss is put into a coma for 9 years. After waking up, we have to name him. Sure, why not have 2 characters named Kaz in the same game? I'm sure they'll be as annoying as each other too. She ain't no space marine or mute scientist. She's a very young adult thrust into a time travel story. And throughout the myriad elements of bullshit that I'm definitely getting into later, considering the arguable home turf of the fanbase, I knew I'd have to hit it sooner or later. Because I had to pick and choose between my upgrades, I got really invested in my arsenal. In fact, I took it way too far at one point.